Fellow performers and friends were also going. That's literally all I knew. I brought an act that I'd been performing around the dive bars in New York. Actually, this act was created on this very stage at the Parkside Lounge. Because this was where I started. And I was pretty clueless, new performer, following along with what the other performers that I was around were also doing. My friends Dirty and Bob told me, you gotta just come to Exotic World. So without knowing anything more, I bought my ticket and showed up with no expectations and very little preparation. The stage that year was brought in by a local event company, and it was a huge runway that felt like it must have been 50 feet, set up alongside an original plywood stage that hugged the edge of the pool by Dixie's trailer. Every year before this, the performance happened poolside, but this year, they were stepping it up. The performances were spaced out all day long, from noon to 9 p.m. And if you know anything about the desert, you know that being outside during the day takes a great deal of preparation, stamina, and it's pretty much not for the faint of heart. There was water everywhere, and we were all reminded of one of the major rules of Exotic World at that time: no booze allowed. I was also shocked to learn that Exotic World at that time was the land of teetotaling stripteasers 365 days of the year. And at that point, I had not quit drinking. So, all performers were put into categories. I obviously was in the newcomer category. I performed around 1 p.m. when the sun was at its very highest and the hottest and gale force winds were whipping through the desert. They were blowing so hard it seemed like keeping a wig or a fan in place was just not going to be an easy feat. Our backstage was a tent with a few mirrors and a few chairs and a large fan set up. Each category would be allowed backstage in the tent during the performance set. I remember sitting backstage looking at the other performers' costumes, realizing suddenly that the stark contrast between me and these performers, it was so obvious, and I realized how much I had to learn when I looked down and I did not have one rhinestone on my costume. I'm pretty sure I was wearing an off-the-rack Betsy Johnson dress and Mary Jane heels. My mind was exploding with information from the time I stepped to the desert in the night before. The Friday night before this was the meet and greet in the Holiday Inn Express in Barstow, California. This roadside hotel was not ready for the stripper infiltration that it was receiving that weekend, and neither was I. For some reason, I thought I was going to stripper summer camp, not a glamorous event that I arrived to. So I arrived at the event on Friday night in jeans, a t-shirt, and wet hair from my post-desert drive. And I walked into the conference room and saw a room full of strippers of all ages from 20s to 70s in full makeup, evening gowns, sequins, jewelry, and turning full looks. I took a deep breath and I realized the extent of my wrong outfit choice. And I ran in horror back to my hotel room to rummage through my bags, hoping that I actually brought a dress to wear. I managed to put some sort of cute outfit together, dried my hair, slapped on a little bit of makeup in my face, and went back down to save face. Pretending that no one saw my first outfit, I walked into the room, overwhelmed to see Camille 2000, Dixie Evans, Tempest Storm, and the reason I got into burlesque the first time, in the beginning, Tura Satana. I was absolutely starstruck and had no idea that I was going to meet my idols that night. All of us younger performers crowded around a makeshift wooden stage that the hotel had put up in one of the conference rooms, and we all sat on the carpet as the legends put on a show for us. One after another, legends of burlesque would take the stage and do what they had been doing for decades. Some knew they were going to perform, And some, like Ricky Cortez, put on a spontaneous performance that night. One that I will never forget. She came out wearing a pantsuit and her ultra tan skin glowing gray silver hair done perfectly. She took the stage and you could see the thousands of hours of stage time during her career in the 60s and 70s just oozing out of her. She filled the room with joy and passion and flirted with every single one of us. Then she stripped off her pedestrian clothes to her large cotton grandma panties and grimed her hips in front of us. She licked her fingers, pat her pussy in my direction, then winked, bent over, put her arms between her legs and made a come hither moment between them. Every single one of us sitting on the floor lining the stage lost our minds. I had never seen anyone sell it on stage like this, let alone in granny panties. At this moment will forever live on my mind as one of my biggest inspirations. And this was just the beginning. So I'm sitting in the tent backstage right before my performance. The tent that was no match for the desert heat that was beating down on us. We were backstage trying to stay cool and calm and collected while the wind was blowing so hard against the tarps, it felt like there was a hurricane outside. We were being constantly reminded to stay hydrated and out of the sun as much as possible, and we were warned of the obvious dangers of the desert. I was actually starting to get nervous. Not only was this the largest stage that I had ever performed on, I had no idea what I was doing, and now that there was a fury of desert to add to the mix. Right when I'm getting into my final pieces of my, quote, costume, I am ready to go on. Another performer runs off stage, screaming and crying in pain. She had performed barefoot, only to discover, to everyone's horror, that the black surface of the stage had given her third-degree burns on the bottom of her feet. The show had just taken a turn, and I was terrified. I was nervous, I was excited, I felt like I was home, and I was up next. I hear my name and I walk onto the stage, the wind beating down on me, and I hear a sound that will forever be locked into my memory. At the front of the stage, lined around the runway, was a sea of motorcycles with their engines running. Sitting on top of them were rugged bikers excited for a day filled with strippers in the desert. The desert could not stop them from spending the day on their bikes. Each time a dancer walked on stage, they would rev their engines with delight. There was never been, and probably will never be, another moment where every time I removed an article of clothing, I would hear the roar of an orchestra of Harleys. It sent chills down my spine even now. The feeling of being on stage in this former goat farm was absolutely magical. I finished my act and ran off the stage, exhilarated and greeted by my fellow performers and friends, and congratulated me on my performance. I felt like I finally belonged somewhere. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the sun and watching my fellow strippers dance in the heat, one after another, then cooling off with chats of the legends in the museum, hearing stories about old costumes, their loves of their former lives, and honestly hearing some of the wildest shit I have ever heard from the wildest women I've ever met in my life. These women that I'm honored to call my stripper family. When the sun went down, the party was over. I drove back to the Holiday Inn Express in Barstow and collapsed with exhaustion. This was the first time I began to understand why I wanted to be naked on stage.